This is a copy of William Salmon's late 17th century handbook for artists called Polygraphice, or The Arts of Drawing, Engraving, Etching, Limning, Painting, Washing, Varnishing, Gilding, Coloring, Dyeing, Beautifying, and Perfuming. The 5th edition, published in London in 1685. The letterpress book begins with 32 unpaginated leaves, 64 pages, containing a comprehensive title page, a typically fulsome dedication, a long explanatory preface, a detailed table of contents, and then more than 30 pages of addenda, overlooked by reason of the haste of the press, and finally an errata page, which suggests that what other faults you meet with, correct also with your pen. This copy of the book has been heavily used and abused over the 3 centuries since its publication in 1685. Is it complete, or are there some missing leaves, especially in the preliminary sections? In order to find out, we need to make a systematic examination of the physical makeup or format of Salmon's Polygraphice, the anatomy of this book. The leaves of the book are systematically arranged in 8-leaf or 16-page sections or gatherings. Here are the first 4 Polygraphice gatherings in facsimile. The pages aren't numbered, but at the bottom of some of the rectos, or right-hand pages of the openings, you can see identifying marks or signatures. The title page leaf has no signature, but the rectos of the next 3 leaves are signed capital A2, A3, and A4. Then come 4 leaves without signatures. Similarly, the second gathering begins with 4 leaves signed small a, small a2, a3, and a4, followed by 4 unsigned leaves, and the third and fourth gatherings signed small b and c follow the same pattern. At which point we come to the main text of the book, beginning with page 1 on the recto of leaf B1, and followed by leaves signed B2, B3, and B4, followed by 4 unsigned leaves, followed by 4 leaves signed C1 through C4, followed by 4 unsigned leaves, and so on. The pattern of 4 signed leaves followed by 4 unsigned leaves throughout the preliminaries suggests that this copy of Salmon's book, though battered and worn, is complete. The purpose of this presentation, and the one which follows it, is to set forth a systematic way of using this information in examining the physical makeup or format of books like William Salmon's Polygraphice, books printed on sheets of handmade paper and produced during the handpress period, that is to say, the period between the invention of printing by Gutenberg in about 1450 and the beginning of the 19th century, about 350 years later, when the development of large iron printing presses and machine-made paper began to alter significantly the way books were made. Every book produced during the more than 3 centuries of the handpress period has a bibliographical format. Format is the relationship between the size of the whole sheets of paper used in printing a book and the size of the individual leaves that result when those sheets are folded and assembled into gatherings. 3 of the most common book formats are Folio, Quarto, and Octavo. If a book is made up of whole sheets, each one of which is folded once, creating 2 leaves per sheet, the resulting format is called folio. Folios are usually fairly big books. If a book is made up of whole sheets, each one of which is folded twice, creating 4 leaves per sheet, the resulting format is called quarto. Quartos tend to be rather square-shaped. If a book is made up of whole sheets, each one of which is folded 3 times, creating 8 leaves per sheet, the resulting format is called octavo. Octavos are a convenient size to hold in the hand. It follows that the larger the whole sheets of paper you start out with, the larger the resulting book relative to its format you're going to end up with. Start out with big sheets, and even if you fold them 3 times to produce octavo format, you're going to end up with a relatively large octavo book, like this 1770s edition of the works of Lord Chesterfield. Start out with little sheets, and even if you fold them only once to produce folio format, you're going to end up with a relatively small folio book, like this deteriorating collection of 18th century English statutes. This spaciously designed quarto edition of the works of Pope Benedict XIV is actually larger than the folio edition of English statutes, because though each of Benedict's quarto sheets has been folded twice to the Statutes folio sheets once, Benedict's printer began with much larger sheets of paper. We tend to use the word folio to mean any great big book, but if you start out with whole sheets of handmade paper, each the size of a postcard, then you're going to end up with a very small volume, even in folio. During the hand-press period, all books were printed on individual sheets of handmade paper, produced one sheet at a time on the flat wire surface of a rectangular wooden paper mold. Sheets of handmade paper correspond exactly in shape and size to the molds on which they were made. Sheets for printing usually ranged from about 12 by 15 inches in size to about 20 by 25 inches. Untrimmed sheets of handmade paper always have a ragged or feathery edge called a decal on all four sides. Decals are very handy for determining format. Unfortunately, in most books, they've been cut off. After printing, the folded sheets are sewn together and then trimmed by the bookbinder to get smooth edges suitable for staining or marbling or gilding, though sometimes, lucky for physical bibliographers, especially in temporary or cheap bindings, the decal has been allowed to remain, as with the 1770s Octavo Chesterfield we've already seen. Before the middle of the 18th century, all paper molds had what is called a laid surface, created by a network of crisscrossing wires. Narrow wires, laid close to one another and parallel to the long side of the mold, are held in place by more widely spaced, heavier rows of wire chain stitches running along the tops of the ribs, parallel to the short side of the mold, and most commonly about an inch apart. The impression of a mold's horizontal wires and vertical chains can be clearly seen on the sheets of paper the mold makes, and they provide useful clues in determining format. These impressions are called chain lines and wire lines. The ribs of a paper mold are always parallel to the short side of the mold. The location of the ribs determines the location of the chains on the surface of the mold and the chain lines on the paper itself. Thus, the chain lines of a whole sheet of handmade laid paper are always parallel to the short side of the sheet, and the narrower and fainter wire lines are always parallel to the long side of the sheet. In this demonstration, we'll occasionally be using special sheets of paper like this one, with chain lines and a watermark and a countermark schematically printed on them on both sides in the proper position so that you can see what happens as the sheet gets folded. Sheets folded once to produce folio format have vertical chain lines. Sheets folded twice to produce quarto format have horizontal chain lines. Sheets folded 3 times to produce octavo format have vertical chain lines again, and so on. Paper mold makers often made pictorial patterns out of bent wire and sewed them to the surface of their molds. These patterns create impressions called watermarks on the sheets of paper they make. Because watermarks tend to have a standard position in the center of one half of the sheet, they can be very useful in determining format. Sometimes a secondary mark, called a countermark, will also be present. If so, it will generally be centered on the other half of the sheet, opposite the watermark. Countermarks are frequently made up of letters, words, or a date. Watermarks for handmade paper were made in any number of shapes and sizes: fleur-de-lis, fool's cap, pot, post horn, and many others. Sometimes watermarks include the name or the initials of the papermaker as well. Characteristic watermarks were used in various countries during various periods. For example, the Britannia watermark is common on Dutch paper intended for the 18th century British market. Watermarks are found in somewhat more than half of the paper used for printing during the handpress period. There are a number of standard reference books which catalog watermarks according to their different designs, but in itself, a watermark generally provides suggestive rather than conclusive evidence about where or when the sheet was made. In the middle of the 18th century, papermakers began producing sheets with a wove surface, created, as you can see on this composite demonstration model, by sewing a flat sheet of woven wire, like a modern window screen, on top of the chains and wires of a laid mold. Wove paper generally has a smoother surface than laid paper, without chain lines and wire lines. but sometimes Wove paper will have watermarks and countermarks. The format of books printed on Wove paper tends to be more difficult to figure out than the format of books printed on laid paper, which always has chain lines. Fortunately, the use of Wove paper for printed books becomes common only towards the end of the 18th century. Thus far, we've discussed laid and Wove paper, decals and chain lines, watermarks and countermarks, and gatherings and signatures. Before taking a closer look at the various book formats used during the hand press period, we also need to know a little about the imposition, or arrangement and locking up, of the pages of metal type into an iron frame called a chase, by means of supporting wooden stakes. In Quarto Format, each form contains 4 pages. In Octavo Format, each form contains 8 pages, and so on. Now let's return to Folio Format and start folding some paper. A book in Folio Format consists of sheets folded back once, parallel to the short side of the sheet. Has a watermark and countermark. They will each appear in the middle of opposite leaves in random order. Most folios have gatherings made up of more than one sheet, with each sheet folded once and then nested, one inside the other in the right order, to produce gatherings of 4 leaves or 8 pages, or 6 leaves or 12 pages, and so on. This gathering does have 6 leaves or 12 pages, but it's still folio, because it's made from whole sheets, each of which was folded once to produce 2 leaves. Each leaf is half the size of the whole sheet, the chain lines are vertical, and the watermarks and countermarks are in the center of the leaves. Format, remember, is simply the relationship between the size of the whole sheet and the size of the individual leaf. It has nothing necessarily to do with the number of leaves in a gathering. In folio in 6s, the first leaf is conjugate, that is, connected through the fold with the 6th leaf. The second leaf is conjugate with the 5th leaf, and the third leaf is conjugate with the 4th leaf. As we saw earlier with the preliminary gatherings of Salmon's Polygraphice, the printer provides a signature letter or other symbol at the bottom of each of the first several recto pages to let the binder know how to fold and gather the printed sheets. In this 6-leaf folio gathering, or folio in 6s, from the 1596 Hamburg Polyglot, the first leaf, A1, is conjugate with the 6th leaf, A6. If we find a watermark on, say, the second leaf, A2, of a folio gathering in 6s, and wonder if it has a countermark, we'd have to look for it on A2's conjugate leaf, the 5th leaf, A5. Sometimes you find folios in 8s, folios in 10s, and folios in 12s. But folios whose gatherings are made up of more than 5 or 6 sheets are uncommon throughout most of the hand-press period. If a book in folio format is untrimmed, there will be a decal on all 3 outer edges of each leaf, and there can be no question at all about the format. Even if the book is trimmed and without decals, you can almost always determine folio format so long as the book is printed on laid paper. The chain lines will still be vertical, and the watermarks and countermarks will still be in the middle of the leaves. The trouble begins when you want to determine the format of folio gatherings made up of trim sheets of Wove paper, because there are no decals and no chain lines. If there are no watermarks either, then you may have to guess at the format, primarily from the general size and shape of the leaves. Now we'll turn to Quarto Format. A book in Quarto Format consists of leaves folded twice, the first time folded back parallel to the short side of the whole sheet, and then the second time folded back again, to produce a gathering each of whose leaves is 1/4 of the size of the whole sheet. In Quarto books made with laid sheets, the chain lines will be horizontal. If the sheets have watermarks and countermarks, they will appear in the middle of the inner margins of the leaves, usually split by the gutter. Thus, in order to see the whole watermark in a Quarto gathering, I have to look at 2 conjugate leaves, the first and fourth, or the second and third. Note that the horizontal chain lines of 1 Quarto leaf go through the gutter and come out again on the other side. When the leaves of a quarto gathering are unopened, you have to be careful and do some cautious peeking to see into the gathering, because the unopened folds, called bolts, at the top edges of the leaves impede your progress. The majority of quarto gatherings are in 4s, but some quartos are in 8s, with gatherings made up of 2 sheets, each sheet folded twice as usual for quarto, and then nested in pairs to produce gatherings of 8 leaves or 16 pages. This gathering does have 8 leaves or 16 pages, but it's still quarto, because it's made of whole sheets, each of which was folded twice to produce 4 leaves. Each leaf is 1/4 the size of the whole sheet. The chain lines are horizontal, and the watermarks and countermarks are in the center of the inner margins. Format, remember, is simply the relationship between the size of the whole sheet and the size of the individual leaf. It has nothing necessarily to do with the number of leaves in a gathering. In a 2-sheet or 8-leaf quarto gathering, or quarto in 8s, the 1st and 8th leaves are conjugate, as are leaves 2 and 7, 3 and 6, and 4 and 5, just as with folio in 8s. Sometimes you find quarto gatherings in 6s, with each gathering made up of a full sheet plus half of another sheet. And sometimes you even find quarto gatherings in 2s, with each gathering made up of half of a sheet. But whether it's in 6s or in 2s, you know it's quarto, because the chain lines are horizontal, and the watermarks and countermarks are in the middle of the inner margin. If a quarto is both unopened and untrimmed, there will be bolts across the top edges and decals across the fore and tail edges, and there can be no question at all about the format. Each sheet has been folded twice. Even if the book is trimmed, you can almost always determine quarto format without trouble, so long as the book is printed on handmade laid paper. The chain lines will still be horizontal, and the watermarks and countermarks, if there are any, will still be in the middle of the inner margins. It's harder to determine the format of quartos made up of trim sheets of Wove paper, because there are no bolts and no decals and no chain lines. If there are no watermarks either, then you may have to guess at the format, primarily from the general size and shape of the leaves. Bibliographically speaking, trimmed copies are very inconvenient. Now we'll turn to Octavo Format. A book in Octavo Format consists of sheets folded back 3 times parallel to the short side as usual, to produce a gathering, each of whose leaves is 1/8 of the size of the whole sheet. The 4 corners of the sheet stay at the bottom front of the gathering, so you can see in and check that the signatures are in their proper order. In Octavo books made with laid sheets, the chain lines will be vertical. If the sheets have watermarks, they will appear at the head of the inner margins of the folded gatherings. If there are also countermarks, the countermarks will also appear at the head of the inner margins. Octavo watermarks or countermarks do not always end up neatly quartered and equally divided up among 4 leaves. The division depends on how accurately the mold maker centered the watermark device on its half of the mold, and how carefully the printer centered the sheet in the press. In Octavo Format, if the watermark appears on all or some of leaves 1, 4, 5, or 8, then the countermark, if there is one, will appear on all or some of leaves 2, 3, 6, or 7. Note that the chain lines in Octavo Format march up leaf 1 and back down leaf 4, to which leaf 1 is connected over the top through the bolt. Similarly, the chain lines go up leaf 2 and down leaf 3, up leaf 5 and down leaf 8, and up leaf 6 and down leaf 7. Octavo gatherings usually consist of 8 leaves or 16 pages printed on a full sheet of paper, but you will often find octavo gatherings in 4s, each one consisting of a 4-leaf or 8-page half sheet. These are octavo sheets printed by half-sheet imposition. As we know, in full-sheet octavo format, the printer assembles or imposes the pages of type and supporting furniture into 2 8-page forms, one form for each of the 2 sides of the octavo sheet to be printed. The outer form contains the 2 outside pages of the gathering, leaf 1 recto, page 1, and leaf 8 verso, page 16. It also contains the other 6 pages needed for printing the rest of the 8 pages on this side of the octavo sheet. The inner form contains the 8 pages on the other side of the sheet. Between them, the outer and inner forms contain all 16 of the pages needed to print both sides of the octavo sheet. In Octavo half-sheet, or work-and-turn imposition, the printer needs to set only 8 pages of type before going to press, half as many as the 16 pages needed for Octavo full-sheet imposition. The first 8 pages of type are imposed in a single form in such a way that after one side of the Octavo sheet has been printed or worked off, it can be flipped over end to end and printed again from the same form. After folding, the result is 2 identical copies of the same 4-leaf or 8-page gathering. Later, the binder tears or cuts each sheet into 2 separate 4-leaf halves and uses one half for one copy of the book and the other half for another copy. The chief advantage of half-sheet imposition is that you need less type, no matter what format you're using. The only one who suffers is the binder, who has twice as many gatherings to sew. There's rarely any difficulty in distinguishing Octavo in 4s from Quarto in 4s. 4-leaf Octavo gatherings will have vertical chain lines and watermarks or countermarks at the head of the inner margins. 4-leaf Quarto gatherings will have horizontal chain lines and watermarks or countermarks in the middle of the inner margins. Nor is it generally difficult to distinguish either Octavo in 4s or Quarto in 4s from Folio in 4s, since Folio in 4s will have vertical chain lines and watermarks or countermarks in the center of the leaves. It is harder to determine the format of Octavos made of opened and trimmed sheets of Wove paper because there are no bolts and no chain lines and no decals. If there are no watermarks either, then you may have to guess at the format of the Octavo Wove paper gatherings primarily from the general size and shape of the leaves. We've now covered 3 of the most common book formats: Folio, Quarto, and Octavo. 3 down, 1 to go. The other common book format used during the hand-press period is Duodecimo, or 12mo. A book in Duodecimo format consists of paper folded so that each leaf is 1/12 the size of the whole sheet. Now there's no way you're going to get a duodecimo by folding a sheet in half, and then in half again, and then in half again, and then in half again, and so on. This will give you a folio, or a quarto, or an octavo, or a 16mo, or a 32mo, and so on, but not a duodecimo. The sheet of a gathering in duodecimo format is folded into thirds like a business letter, and also in half twice the other way, in order to divide it into 12 equal-sized leaves. There are 2 major duodecimo formats, about equally common in the 17th and 18th centuries. One is duodecimo by cutting, and the other is duodecimo by half-sheet imposition. First, duodecimo by cutting. A book in duodecimo format by cutting consists of printed sheets which are torn or cut into 2 unequal pieces, the smaller 1/3 part consisting of 4 leaves arranged side by side, and the larger 2/3 part consisting of the remaining 8 leaves. The larger 8-leaf part is folded just as if it were a full octavo sheet. The smaller 4-leaf part is folded twice to create a 4-leaf section. At this point in duodecimo format by cutting, there are 2 possibilities. One possibility is to insert the 4-leaf section into the center of the 8-leaf section in order to end up with a single whole sheet gathering of 12 leaves, or duodecimo by cutting in 12s. This is the way English printers tended to impose their duodecimos by cutting, producing books consisting of a succession of equal 12-leaf gatherings. The other possibility is to keep the 8-leaf and the 4-leaf section separate, sewing them into place, one after the other, and ending up with duodecimo by cutting in 8s and 4s. This is the way continental printers tended to impose their duodecimos by cutting, producing books consisting of alternating 8-leaf and 4-leaf gatherings, an 8-leaf gathering followed by a 4-leaf gathering, another 8 followed by another 4, and so on. If the duodecimo sheets have a laid surface, the chain lines will be horizontal. If there are watermarks or countermarks, they will appear somewhere between the head and the middle of the 4 edges. These positions hold true not only for the 2 kinds of duodecimo formats by cutting, but also for the other major duodecimo format, duodecimo in half-sheet imposition. A book in half-sheet duodecimo format consists of printed sheets which are torn or cut in half parallel to the long side of the sheet into 2 equal pieces, each one containing 6 leaves of identical printing. Each of the 6-leaf pieces is then treated separately in the same way. The top 2-leaf part is cut away from the bottom 4-leaf part and then folded in half. The bottom 4-leaf part is folded 2 times, The first time back parallel to the short side as usual, and then back again. Finally, the 2-leaf part is inserted into the 4-leaf part in order to produce a duodecimo gathering of 6 leaves. In the 18th century, both duodecimo by cutting and duodecimo by half-sheet imposition are common. Toward the end of the century, you begin seeing 18mos, books consisting of sheets imposed for 3 equal 6-leaf gatherings, each one of which is folded like a half-sheet duodecimo gathering. The 2-leaf parts are folded and tucked into the 4-leaf parts, and each sheet produces 3 different 6-leaf gatherings. If the 18mo is printed on laid paper, the chain lines will be vertical. Watermarks can appear almost anywhere in 18mo and smaller format gatherings, but wherever they are, they will almost always follow a consistent pattern from gathering to gathering. 16mos have never been very common. On the other hand, you will often find 24mos or 32mos in such small book formats as pocket devotionals and chapbooks. There are a number of ways of imposing 24mos and 32mos, and I suspect that many printers didn't bother to memorize their fairly complicated imposition schemes, but simply consulted relevant imposition charts like the ones given in various 18th century and later printing manuals, many of which have been reprinted in facsimile. In any event, we won't bother you with the details of these formats, some of which have so many variations you'd think you were in an origami concentration camp before you worked them all out. At the beginning of the 19th century, paper makers began making paper on Fourdrinier machines, which produced wide webs or rolls of finished paper to any length desired. Machine-made paper was usually sold cut into convenient-sized pieces, without decals, and, especially in the first half of the 19th century, generally with a wove surface and without watermarks. Throughout the 19th century and later, the terms folio, quarto, octavo, and duodecimo were often used in the book trade to describe books printed on various standard-sized pieces of machine-made paper. But books printed on a web of machine-made paper do not have bibliographical format, because format is the relationship between the size of a whole handmade sheet of paper and the size of the individual leaf, and, bibliographically speaking, machine-made paper does not come in sheets, but only in larger or smaller pieces. For this reason, determining the exact anatomy of 19th and 20th century books can be very difficult. But it is almost always possible to determine the format of a book produced during the hand-press period. Remember the preliminary gatherings of William Salmon's Polygraphice, the late 17th century artist's handbook we looked at back at the beginning of this presentation? Each of the preliminary gatherings, again shown in facsimile, has 8 leaves. The first one signed capital A, and the next 3 signed small a, b, and c. The chain lines of these 8-leaf gatherings are vertical, and the watermarks at the heads of the inner margins confirm Octavo Format. Clearly, we have here 4 8-leaf octavo gatherings, and, despite their lack of pagination, we can be confident that all 4 of these gatherings are complete. But many of the books produced during the hand-press period have led hard lives over the centuries, and you never know what you're going to find out about them once you begin to examine them closely. Once you've determined the format of a book, you can then establish its collation, the exact order of its gatherings and leaves, and establishing a book's collation is the subject of our next presentation.